Actually, I don't think what they're doing is sustainable beyond next year. Yes, they have a population that's three times the size of Ukraine, but it's well known that this is not a healthy population, and you have a hard time finding too many Russians that actually want to join the army and come into Ukraine. They know what happens. Now the Russians also know, the Kremlin knows that this is not sustainable. That's why they have avoided recruiting heavily from Moscow and St. Petersburg because they don't want a bunch of funerals happening in those cities. Instead, the funerals tend to happen out in the poorer regions of the Russian Federation, central and eastern Russia, um, where people are willing to take the bonus of money if they join the military. And the Kremlin doesn't care about those casualties. But I don't think that they can maintain their industry and an army of the size that they need given the casualties they're suffering.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're once again talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges served for 38 years in the US Army, commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. We always appreciate your time on Frontline, General. Welcome back.
Well, James, thanks, and I always appreciate the privilege of being on your program.
I wanted to start by putting to you something we were discussing on yesterday's episode of Frontline. I was talking to the historian, Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky, and he said, in his view, last week's decision by the US to allow American-supplied weapons to strike targets inside Russia could be a turning point in this war. Do you agree?
Well, turning point is a pretty strong word, especially when you consider how limited the actual policy decision is. It still prohibits the use of the 300-kilometer ATACMS for use at legitimate targets inside Russia, and it also limits this new policy to the area that is linked to Kharkiv. So not I don't see that as quite such a turning point. It's good news, obviously, and the Ukrainians didn't waste any time in hitting targets, air defense weapons, logistics, etc., on the Russian side of the border. And surprise, surprise, Russia did not retaliate with nuclear weapons. So, we just continue to deter ourselves because of an excessive fear that Russia might do something about it. I think this this hesitancy and indecision and incremental decision making is a reflection of the fact that we have not committed to helping Ukraine win. We still don't have a clearly defined end state for this war, and it's difficult to have good policy if you don't have a clearly defined end state.
Why is that, do you think? Because, repeatedly since the start of this conflict, since the full-scale invasion, time and again, we've seen Ukraine requesting certain pieces of military support and initially being met with resistance, whether it's anti-tank missiles or main battle tanks or the ATACMS, or now being able to use Western weapons inside Russia. And resistance at first to giving way eventually. Had we been more proactive, as in fairness to you, generally, you've been calling for all along, surely we'd be in a very different situation.
I think it'd be a completely different situation. I mean, think about Russia's inability to exploit the 6-month window in which no U.S. aid was forthcoming and Europe did not step up to fill that gap. So almost half a year, and Russia was not able to really exploit that in any meaningful way. They've barely moved beyond Avdiivka or Bakhmut, and they're not going to be able to capture Kharkiv or overrun the Ukrainian defenses around there. Now, to be clear, it's hell for civilians that live in Kharkiv, and it's very difficult for Ukrainian troops that are getting pounded by Russian artillery. But the fact is, Russia does not have the ability to overrun or knock out Ukraine. And so, if we had been providing everything that was needed for Ukraine to win, versus providing them just enough to keep them in the fight, I think we would see significant losses, even more significant losses of Russian military capability. Sakur, General Cavoli said, you can defeat mass, which is Russia's only advantage. You can defeat mass with precision by going after headquarters, logistics, and artillery. And we did not provide that to the Ukrainians as we should have.
Well, that does beg the question what more we should be doing at the moment. How much more proactive should the West and Ukraine's allies be? Should we be looking at a no-fly zone, for instance? Should we be looking at troops, NATO troops on the ground, as Macron has sort of suggested at times? What more do you think we should be doing, General?
Well, at the risk of sounding like a scratch record, the first thing we've got to do is determine what is our desired outstate or outcome. What is the strategic objective for what we're doing? Obviously, it should be help Ukraine defeat Russia, because it is in the strategic interests of the United States, of the UK, of everybody in Europe that Russia is defeated, forced back to its own borders, the 1991 sovereign borders of Ukraine, to force Russia to live within their own borders, to defeat them in Ukraine. It's in our interest that that happens for economic reasons, for security reasons, and also for the reason of values. What we claim we value so much, the international rules-based order, respect for sovereignty, respect for freedom of navigation, respect for human rights, respect for international law. That's what's at stake here. And of course, the Chinese are watching to see if we really are serious about those things. So the first thing that should happen would be my president, the German Bundeskanzler, your prime minister, President Macron, and others say it is our strategic objective that Ukraine defeats Russia, wins the war. If you did that, first of all, that would open the gates then for providing everything that's needed. Secondly, that would tell the Kremlin that their only hope was that we were going to quit has been dashed, and that they are the ones that should desperately be trying to salvage what they can. If we've done that, now we start talking about practical implementation. Policy decisions like establishing a no-fly zone, that is a policy decision. But to do a no-fly zone, this is not like Star Trek, where big giant deflector shields come up, but where you have to put Royal Air Force, U.S. Air Force, German Luftwaffe pilots up in the air and that are prepared to destroy Russian air defense systems that may even be inside Russia. You cannot have a no-fly zone if the enemy is able to shoot down your aircraft. And you also have to be prepared to go in and pick up pilots that have been shot down that may have parachuted to the ground inside Russia. These are important considerations for a policy of no-fly zone. Now, you could also, of course, think about putting U.S. or British or French air defense systems with American, British, or French crews inside Ukraine to augment what they already have. But you just need to be aware that there's a very good chance that some of them are going to be destroyed because the Russians will come after them. So I'm not against having American troops on the ground there, but if I was the chief of the U.S. Army and I was told, get ready to deploy your men and women into Ukraine, I'd say, great, we'll be ready. But for what purpose? What is the objective? Why are we doing this? What are we hoping to accomplish? It's too easy for our political leaders to throw troops at a problem, to throw airplanes at a problem without ever thinking through to the end state. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan and only had a clear objective in the first year. And then after that, we had different policies, and it all ended in a catastrophe because we lost sight of the original reason for being there.
Which I suppose begs the question, General, how do you define Ukraine winning this war? Is it reclaiming all the territory that Russia has occupied since 2022? Is it reclaiming the territory that Russia has occupied since 2014? What should we consider Ukraine and Ukraine's victory to be?
Well, James, that's the easiest question you've asked me. President Zelensky has said it's restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, which means the 1991 borders. I completely agree with that. That should be our objective. Otherwise, if we only push back to the 2022 border, that means that Russian aggression that started in 2014 that led to the illegal annexation of Crimea and the support of the so-called separatists in the Donbass, that they would be rewarded for that. And certainly nobody that's ever read a history book or looked at a map really believes that Russia would live up to any agreement where they kept Ukraine, or excuse me, Crimea, and said, okay, that's all we ever really wanted. No serious person will believe that all they wanted is just Crimea. And then I think investors are going to be very reluctant to put serious money into the reconstruction of Ukraine after the conflict, after the war is over, if Russia still controls Crimea, because that will block access in and out of Azov Sea, where two of Ukraine's 5 main seaports, Mariupol and Verdansk, even after they're liberated, won't be rebuilt or won't be able to function again for Ukraine, because Russia will control access to Azov Sea if they still occupy Crimea, and that big Kerch Bridge is still standing there. So I think that this is very short-sighted and naive for anybody to think that Ukraine could be okay, that this would be a good outcome with Russia retaining control of the 2022 territory. And then if we're serious, if we're serious about what we say with respect for sovereignty and the UN Charter and the international rules-based order, all those things, how can you allow Russia to keep what they've taken? And the Chinese will certainly be taking note that we were unwilling to really stand up for what we say or claim is so important. And it's much more difficult to do that out in the Indo-Pacific region than it is in Europe. So victory, it's restoration of Ukrainian sovereign territory, return of the 20,000 plus Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped and dispersed all over Russia, accountability for war crimes, and then a security arrangement for Ukraine, which should be NATO membership. Anything short of NATO membership is not a guarantee, but we're going to have to do things to make sure that Russia does not re-attack Ukraine.
Hello, it's James here. Sorry to interrupt this episode of Frontline. We'll be right back with the main interview in just a moment. I just wanted to jump in to mention a brand new channel we're going to be launching on YouTube that I have a feeling you're going to love. It's called History Undone. And if you like Frontline, I reckon this is going to be up your street. Every episode, we're going to be undoing a different iconic moment in history. In other words, we'll take a famous event or battle and replay it and explore what the long-term historical consequences would have been had certain key factors panned out differently. I'll be joined each time by a top historian and a military strategist, and in the very first episode of History Undone, we're going to be winding the clock back 80 years and going back to Operation Overlord, aka D-Day, and looking at the American landing on Omaha Beach. So check it out, like and subscribe. It's History Undone. I mean, I think, to be honest, General, pretty much everyone watching will agree with you on that. I suppose the suspicion is, though, that the White House and that Ukraine's allies in Europe may take a different view and may see the end of this conflict involving allowing Russia to, for example, keep Crimea. Where do you think the White House's thinking is at the moment on this?
Unfortunately, I think you're right. I mean, the fact that they can't even say the words, it's our objective for Ukraine to win, speaks volumes. The fact that the decision making over the last 2+ years has been so slow, so incremental, so it did not contribute in a way to achieving the strategic objective that we're talking about, tells you that they are not fully committed to helping Ukraine win. Now, look, the Biden White House deserves huge credit for helping to keep 50 plus nations together, for all that has been provided. But unfortunately, the priority in the White House has been escalation management, as if somehow there's a rail stat that you can adjust left and right to control Russia. That's not how it works. And I think that the administration probably would be satisfied if this whole thing just kind of ground to a halt, and that Russia agreed to, okay, we'll stop. Just let us keep what we have. And by the way, Ukraine cannot join NATO. So Russia would have achieved much of what they wanted. And I think that there are, unfortunately, a lot of really good, patriotic, smart, hardworking people in the White House that have been dead wrong about Russia, both when they worked in the Obama administration and now when they work in the Biden administration. So I don't see that changing significantly, unfortunately, in the next few months. Having said that, the United States is one country. Europe is going to pay an enormous price if Ukraine fails or if Russia is not defeated. Millions more Ukrainian refugees are going to head into Europe. The disruption to energy and food supplies are going to continue to affect all of us economically. And the Chinese are going to learn a lesson from this, that the West can be easily deterred just by the threat of moving a tactical nuclear weapon into Belarus. It causes us to stop in our tracks. That's a terrible message to send to Iran, North Korea, China, and anybody else that has or wants to have a nuclear weapon.
So talk me through, General, were the US and Europe to make a collective decision, we are going to give Ukraine everything it needs to win this war, to push Russia back to the pre-2014 borders, what would then happen? How would you then achieve that victory? What needs to happen from that point?
Yeah, so I think there's three main things that have to happen. Assuming now that all of our leaders have said publicly, just like Churchill and Roosevelt did after the Arcadia Conference in January 1942, where they made the decision, defeat Germany first. And then in 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, Churchill and Roosevelt again said, the end state of this war is unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. Not get Hitler to a better negotiating position, but to unconditional surrender. So that clarity of end state, clarity of priority, that's what enabled the United States, where most Americans did not want to go into a European war. If you, I'm sure you're aware, and your listeners are aware, most Americans had zero interest in getting back into a war in Europe in 1940-41. But Roosevelt and Churchill together were able to explain what was at stake. And that's what then, and they gave the president the foundation to win the confidence of the Congress and the American people to convert our industries to what was needed and to grow the massive armies, navies, and air forces that were needed to work with our allies to defeat Nazi Germany and then the Empire of Japan. So that's why I keep banging on about how important it is to have a clearly defined strategic end state. Now, let's assume that's been done. Obviously, we've got to provide the air and missile defense capabilities to protect Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian people from the murder that they're suffering from Russian glide bombs and multi-million-dollar weapons that are being launched into the middle of cities. So increasing their ability to protect their infrastructure and their people has got to be a priority. But that also includes them having the ability to hit the airfields from which Russian airstrikes are being launched. The former Supreme Allied Commander, General Breedlove, he uses a phrase, it's better to kill the archer than to try and intercept all of the arrows. I completely agree with that we should be helping Ukraine destroy all the places from which Russia is launching these murderous attacks against innocent people. The second thing that's got to happen is that we have got to use all of our economic tools to isolate Russia from what it gets from China, from Iran, and from North Korea. I can't believe that the combined economies and navies of the West, the so-called West, allies and partners, that we're not able to stop what's going into Russia. I'm not naive, but I can't believe we hadn't come up with a better way to do that. Russia is still exporting oil and gas and stolen wheat from Ukraine out through the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus, and then transloading it to other ships that then sell it in Syria, for example. But there are also this so-called shadow fleet, about which Elizabeth Bra has done good work. It sails out through the Baltic Sea. I mean, almost every week there's a ship that's unseaworthy, not properly insured, not in compliance with international law, and they sail out carrying millions of liters of oil. That's what keeps Russia in the fight. We have got to be able to use all of our economic tools. If we were serious about winning, that would have already taken place. And then the third thing that we've got to do, of course, is give Ukraine the long range precision strike capability. That means more U.S. 300 kilometer range ATACMS. Germany needs to get off of the dime and provide the 500 kilometer range Taurus. And then France and UK with their excellent Scalp and Storm Shadow systems. I mean, we should be in full wartime production of these capabilities. That's what destroys Russian headquarters, Russian logistics, and Russian artillery.
And do you think Ukraine should be allowed to use those weapons, for example, to strike Moscow itself? Because there is an argument that unless the war comes to mainland Russia and really impacts ordinary Russians and those in Moscow around Putin, that there won't be any internal pressure on him.
Well, of course, none of those weapons, which I just named, can reach Moscow. Moscow is more than 700 kilometers from Kharkiv. So even if they lined up a bunch of ATACMS being fired from the HIMARS launchers around Kharkiv, they'd fall well short. Now, the fact that Ukraine has launched some drones to, I think, symbolically hit the Kremlin back a year or two ago, just like when the United States launched the famous Doolittle raid to hit Japan shortly after Pearl Harbor, it was more symbolic to send the signal that to the Japanese that they were not safe from an American counterstrike. But I think the Ukrainians have no interest in symbolic strikes against Moscow. What they're interested in is devastating the Russian oil and gas industry, which pays for this war. But the weapons that we would be providing are the kind that would knock out headquarters, logistics, artillery, airfields, radar, the things necessary for Russia to prosecute their war against Ukraine. The Ukrainians are not interested, I think, in doing the other things. There's more than enough targets inside Russian occupied Ukraine and in the 400 kilometers deep into Russia that are legitimate military targets and for which there is no legal or moral reason not to allow them to hit those targets.
As things stand, General, when do you think Ukraine may be in a position to launch a new counteroffensive?
Well, I think we're at a point in the war now where their priority is to stabilize. There may be some tactical successes on either side, back and forth over individual villages, that sort of thing. But I don't see Russia having the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war or vice versa. So instead, for Ukraine, this is about maintaining their strategic bombing, if you will, which is the strikes on their oil and gas platform, continue their efforts to make Crimea, the decisive terrain of this war, uninhabitable and unusable for the Russian Navy, Air Force, and Army. Doing that exactly as they did when they had the first British Storm Shadows were used to destroy the Ukrainian dry dock in Sevastopol and the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, where they proved the concept of making Crimea untenable with long-range precision weapons. The Black Sea Fleet is evacuating there. So I think they're going to continue the pressure on Crimea, both in terms of making it untenable, that's the right word, for the Russians, but also isolating it by going after the railroad that connects Crimea back to Russia, continuing to destroy ships that would be used to move stuff across Azov Sea to Crimea. And then, of course, eventually that big bridge is going to go down when the Ukrainians are ready for it to go down. That's going to continue. But in order to launch a counterstrike, they're going to have to become very, very confident and comfortable and experienced with air power, which, they're going to see an increase in air power. I don't know how much or exactly when, but over the next coming months, we'll see that. The Ukrainians will grow their ability. They already know how to fly very well, but fighting F-16s in operations is different from just being able to fly the aircraft. So that'll be part of it. I'm sure they won't try some sort of counterstrike or counteroffensive until they have mastered the air-ground teamwork required, which they did not do last year. But also, they've got to grow the size of the army. They don't have a people problem. There's probably 2 million women and men that are military age that could be in uniform, but they started slow in developing the infrastructure required for recruiting and training new units. That's got to happen. And I think that's feasible that they could have several more brigades that are properly equipped and trained by the end of this year. And so then now you're starting to talk about having the conditions right for a successful counterattack.
It's a really interesting point you raised there about manpower. And of course, Russia, given its population is so much bigger, has an advantage in that sense. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on the Russian casualty rate. I mean, the Ukrainian General Staff claimed last week that Russia had suffered more than 1,000 casualties in a day. And there are reports, meanwhile, that Russia is forcibly sending troops with serious medical issues to the front line, that is trying to militarize deported Ukrainian youth. How sustainable is the Russian casualty rate?
Actually, I don't think what they're doing is sustainable beyond next year. Yes, they have a population that's 3 times the size of Ukraine, but it's well known that this is not a healthy population. And you have a hard time finding too many Russians that actually want to join the army and come into Ukraine. They know what happens. Now, the Russians also know, the Kremlin knows that this is not sustainable. That's why they have avoided recruiting heavily from Moscow and St. Petersburg because they don't want a bunch of funerals happening in those cities. Instead, the funerals tend to happen out in the poorer regions of the Russian Federation, central and eastern Russia, where people are willing to take the bonus of money if they join the military. And the Kremlin doesn't care about those casualties. But I don't think that they can maintain their industry and an army of the size that they need given the casualties they're suffering. It's now more profitable for a man to leave his job at the tank factory and join the army. He gets more money if he does that. So their manpower shortage is also being felt on the industry side. So the pressure won't be because mothers are out there wailing away at their sons and husbands being killed, as what happened in Afghanistan. It'll be because they just can't keep it up. And I think that part of our effort should be to help reach the Russian population somehow, conducting information operations and or making them feel the impact of Ukraine destroying the oil and gas industry. That will affect Russians' daily lives as well.
Just finally, General, there is a certain irony that we're having this conversation as world leaders are gathering in Normandy for the 80th anniversary commemorations of Operation Overlord, of D-Day, of course. And I just wonder what lessons we should be drawing from the events of the Second World War, particularly amid heightened speculation that we are on course at some point for a third.
So, 3 things come to mind immediately, and thanks for bringing that up, James. First of all, clear-eyed, courageous, strategic leadership. Leaders that can know that in conditions of uncertainty, they understand what is at stake. That what happens if we lose, everything we care about, what the price of that failure is, and I think that's missing today. And it's not like we're stupider or more stupid than we were back in 1944. We're not as courageous as we were back in 1944. We've lost confidence in ourselves and in our institutions, and we've allowed Russia to influence how we think, and now we're terrified that they might do something that they're actually not going to do. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is the scale required to defend what we say is so important in terms of our defense industries, ammunition production, ships, planes, all the stuff that's needed uh, to take advantage of new technologies that are out there on a scale that's necessary to defeat Russia, isolate Iran, deter North Korea, and deter China. I mean, that's the strategic problem set we have, and all of those are connected. These are not 4 separate small problems. All of these are connected in such a way that we have to show that we have the political will, the industrial capacity, and military capability to do all those tasks. Defeat Russia first, isolate Iran, which will happen once Russia has been defeated, deter North Korea, and deter China from making a terrible decision. And then the third and final thing, of course, is quality women and men in uniform and in all of our services. It doesn't matter what your technology is if you don't have committed, trained, disciplined women and men serving in uniform to perform all those tasks with whatever technology our governments provide to them.
General Hodges, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for the privilege.